There is a phrase that, when said calmly and without anger, completely disarms the difficult person in front of you. It is not an insult. It is not an accusation. It is a question. And Kant developed the principle behind it 200 years before you needed it at work. The problem is not that difficult people exist. The problem is that you still do not know what to do when they show up. And until that changes, they will keep having power over you. Power you handed them. Without realizing it, that changes today. Because Kant was not just an abstract philosopher writing about pure reason in the isolation of Königsberg. He was a man who understood deeply what happens when a human being loses control of their own mind. And he had a name for it: heteronomy, the law coming from outside. But let us slow down, because before we get to the phrases, you need to understand why they work. And that starts with a distinction that will change the way you see every conflict you have ever had in your life. What Kant noticed was not something new about philosophy. It was something old about human beings. When someone is being difficult with you at work, two things happen almost simultaneously. The first is physical. The body reacts. The second is philosophical. You forget that you have a choice. And it is that second forgetting that Kant spent his entire life trying to reverse. Not the first. The body will always react. That is biology. But forgetting that you have a choice, that is education, or the lack of it. If you are here right now, listening to this, you have probably been in a situation like this. A meeting where someone interrupted you in front of everyone, a colleague who took credit for your work, a manager who humiliated you publicly, and then acted like nothing happened. An environment where the rules seem to exist to protect the wrong people. And you stood there, feeling something strange in your chest. Not exactly anger, not exactly shame. Something between the two. The feeling that you should have said something and did not. Or that you did say something and made it worse. Kant would call that a defeat of autonomy, and he would understand completely, because he did not arrive at this philosophy by thinking about abstractions. He arrived at it by observing, for decades, what happens to human beings when they lose the thread of their own reason, when they start acting like mirrors of what surrounds them, instead of acting like beings who choose. And the workplace is perhaps the place where that happens most often. Think about an ordinary workday. You receive an aggressive email before 9 in the morning. You walk into a meeting already knowing someone is going to contradict everything you did the week before. You spend your lunch break calculating how to respond without sounding defensive. And at the end of the day, you leave feeling like you spent 90% of your mental energy on conflicts that should never have existed. That is the real cost of not having the right tools. It is not just emotional, it is cognitive. And it is exactly the problem that Kant dedicated his philosophy to solving, without ever knowing he was talking about Monday morning meetings. There is a fundamental difference between reacting and responding. Reacting is automatic. It is the nervous system making decisions for you. Someone attacks you. You attack back, or you retreat, or you freeze. All of that happens before you have chosen anything. Responding is different. Responding requires 1 second. 1 second where you choose. And that second is exactly the space where Kant lived his entire life. He called it practical reason, the capacity to act from principles you consciously chose, instead of being driven by impulses you did not choose. The distinction sounds simple, but most people never actually practice it. Because the moment someone is difficult with you, the body wants to react immediately, without pause, without choice. and the body is much faster than reason. That is not a moral failure. That is biology. The sympathetic nervous system does not wait for you to think. It acts. What Kant proposed was not denying the impulse. It was creating a space between the impulse and the action. A minimal space, but a real one. And in that space, everything is possible. If you are enjoying this perspective and want to keep receiving analysis like this, consider subscribing to the channel. People who are still listening at this point are usually the kind who prefer to understand the game rather than just play it. Now, let us go back to Kant, because here is what most people do not know about him. Kant was famous in Königsberg, not only as a professor, as a host. He gave frequent dinners. He gathered people from different social classes, different opinions, different temperaments, and there was an unspoken rule at those dinners. No one left without having been intellectually challenged. Kant did not tolerate superficiality, but he also did not tolerate unnecessary brutality. There is a recorded account of a student who once tried to humiliate a colleague during one of those gatherings. The argument was technically correct, but the tone was condescending, impatient, destructive. Kant listened in silence for several minutes. He let the student finish. Then he asked a single question. Are you trying to convince, or are you trying to win? The table went quiet. Not because it was an accusation, not because it was an attack, but because it was a distinction the student had never made for himself. He did not know the answer. And the absence of an answer was already an answer. That is exactly what the right phrases do. They do not attack. They illuminate. And the person who was attacking suddenly finds themselves standing in front of themselves, without being humiliated, without being confronted with anger. Just a precise question that opened a space they did not know was closed. That is the level of skill we are building here. Now, let us get to the phrases, 8 of them, each one built on a different Kantian principle, each one for a different situation, and each one with the same goal, to give you back control of the conversation without destroying the relationship. Because in workplace environments, destroying relationships has a cost, even when the other person deserves it, even when you are right, even when everything in you wants to explode. Kant knew that. He spent decades inside a rigid academic structure, with competitive colleagues, with superiors who did not always deserve the positions they held, and he survived all of it with his reputation intact, not by being passive, not by being submissive, but by being precise. Phrase 1. I need a moment to think before I respond. Simple. Devastatingly effective. When someone attacks you verbally, the instinct is to respond at the same speed. That is exactly what the difficult person wants. Because when you react fast, you react badly. You say things you did not intend to say. You reveal vulnerabilities you did not want to reveal. You lose the thread of your own logic. This phrase does something powerful. It pauses the rhythm of the attack. It signals that you are in control. And it gives you the second Kant was talking about. The second where reason can function. Difficult people have power because they control the timing of the conversation. They set the pace. They know that the faster you have to respond, the less you think. This phrase gives the time back to you. And nothing frustrates someone who uses speed as a weapon more than a person who simply refuses to play at that pace. Phrase 2. Can I ask what you expect me to do with that information? This phrase is for when someone shares a criticism, a complaint, or an attack, with no constructive proposal attached. Pure emotional discharge directed at you. No real objective, just the need to point out something wrong with you, without offering anything in return. Kant had a principle called the categorical imperative. The central idea is this: act only according to principles you could want to be universal. A criticism without a proposal is not feedback. It is vanity disguised as communication. It is the need to feel superior, wrapped in professional language. This question forces the other person to articulate what they actually want, what they expect to change, what they are actually asking for. And often, they do not know, because they never stopped to think about it. They only knew they wanted to say something. And when you ask this question with genuine curiosity, not sarcasm, you create a mirror moment. The person sees themselves. Sometimes, that is enough to change everything. Phrase 3. I understand you're frustrated. What do we need to solve right now? This phrase contains two simultaneous movements. First, validation. You are not denying the other person's emotion. You are not telling them they are wrong to feel what they feel. You are acknowledging that the emotion exists and that it is real for them. Second, redirection. You are refusing to enter the emotional drama and pulling the conversation back to the actual problem, to what can be done, to what matters. Kant would say that emotions are data. They inform, they signal, but they should not govern. This phrase acknowledges the data and refuses to be governed by it. There is a subtlety here worth noting. The word we places you and the other person in the same field. It is not what you need to fix, and it is not what I need to do. It is us. That shifts the dynamic from attack and defense to shared problem. And shared problems are much easier to solve than personal conflicts. Phrase 4. What evidence do you have to support that? This one is for when someone makes a claim about you, your work, or your competence, without any real foundation. A claim that sounds like truth because of its tone, but when examined, has no actual structure. The phrase sounds simple, but it is philosophically devastating. Kant spent decades arguing that claims without rational foundation are literally empty. They are not truths. They are noise with the shape of an argument. They are feelings dressed up as facts. When you ask for evidence calmly, you are not being defensive. You are not attacking. You are applying the most basic standard of rational thinking, the same standard any adult should apply to any claim about anything. And people who attack without foundation do not enjoy being reminded that they need one, because most of the time they never looked for one. They never needed to, because most people back down before asking. You are not going to back down. Phrase 5. I'm going to need more context to understand your point. For when someone makes a vague accusation, something ambiguous enough to be interpreted in several ways, the classic comment that could be criticism or could be a compliment, depending on how you react. Vagueness is a sophisticated weapon. It puts you on the defensive, without the other person having said anything specific enough for you to refute. If you defend yourself, you look guilty. If you ignore it, it looks like you confirmed it. If you ask them to repeat, it looks like you did not understand. There is no easy exit. Except this one. This phrase refuses to play that game. It does not interpret the ambiguity in any direction. It simply asks for more. It forces specificity. And specificity is the natural enemy of manipulation, because manipulation needs empty space to exist. When you fill that space with clarity, manipulation has nowhere to live. Subscribe to the channel if you want to keep receiving this kind of analysis. A philosopher who died 200 years ago still has a lot to say about what happens in Monday morning meetings. Phrase 6. Can I suggest we continue this conversation when we have more time to do it properly? This phrase is for when a difficult conversation is happening at the wrong moment. In the rush before a meeting. In the hallway with 3 people. Listening. Over a message at 11 at night. In those moments, anything you say will be misinterpreted because the context is working against you. Kant understood that the conditions of a conversation determine its outcome just as much as the words used. You cannot have a rational conversation under maximum emotional pressure. You cannot resolve a complex conflict in 30 seconds, not because you are weak, but because no one can. This phrase does not retreat. It reorganizes the conditions. It proposes a better moment without denying the problem. There is an enormous difference between running away from a conversation and choosing when to have it. The first is weakness. The second is strategy. And most people never learn the difference. Phrase 7. I respect your perspective, and I have a different view. This phrase seems small, but it contains a deep philosophical refusal. The refusal to pretend agreement to avoid conflict. The refusal to disappear in order to keep the peace. The refusal to betray your own assessment because someone is pressuring you to abandon it. Kant considered intellectual dishonesty one of the most serious forms of moral failure, not because he was cruel to dishonest people, but because he understood that when you pretend to agree with what you do not believe, you corrupt the only tool you have for navigating the world: reason. When you say you respect the other person's perspective and immediately assert your own, you are doing something most people avoid. You are being honest without being aggressive. You are refusing to disappear. You are saying clearly and without drama that 2 things can be true at the same time, that 2 perspectives can coexist without one destroying the other. And difficult people often count on your willingness to disappear. When you do not disappear, the game changes. Phrase 8. What do you need from me right now? This is the most counterintuitive of the 8, because when someone is being difficult with you, the last thing you want is to ask what they need. It feels like submission. It feels like you are capitulating. It feels like you are rewarding bad behavior with attention. But here is the paradox. Most difficult behavior at work is not about you. It is about something the other person cannot articulate, an insecurity that was never resolved, a fear of losing relevance, pressure from above that has no rational outlet, a need for control that was born somewhere you do not know and probably never will. When you ask what they need, you shift the entire frame of the conversation. You stop being the target, and you start being a possibility. This does not mean you are their therapist. It means you are smart enough to know that solving the real problem is far more efficient than winning the surface conflict. Kant would call this treating the other person as an end in themselves, not as an obstacle, not as an enemy to be defeated, as a human being with an unmet need, which may or may not be reasonable, which may or may not deserve your empathy, but which needs to be named before it can be resolved. You know what is most interesting about this phrase? The fact that only truly secure people can ask it, because they are not afraid to hear the answer. They do not need to win. They need to understand. And understanding has never been weakness. It has always been the most sophisticated move available in any room. These phrases are not magic. They do not transform impossible people into reasonable collaborators overnight. They do not fix structurally toxic environments. They do not replace difficult conversations that need to happen. What they do is more subtle and more powerful. They give back something the toxic environment is trying to steal from you: your presence, your clarity, your time, and above all, the thread of your own reason. Because that is exactly what gets lost when you react instead of respond. You do not just lose the conversation, you lose contact with who you chose to be. Kant would say that autonomy is not something you win once and put in a drawer. It is something you practice every time someone tries to make you react instead of respond. Every difficult conversation is a disguised question, not from the other person, from yourself. The question is, will you act according to principles you chose, or will you be driven by impulses you did not choose? There is a detail of Kant's life that most biographies mention in passing, but deserves more attention. For decades, he was a university professor under a system that required him to teach doctrines he did not always agree with, philosophies he considered incomplete, systems he was silently dismantling in his notebooks while teaching them out loud in the classroom. He did not collapse. He did not sabotage. He did not become bitter. He built, slowly, with patience, with precision. And at 57 years old, he published The Critique of Pure Reason, one of the most important books in the history of Western thought, written by a man who spent decades in an environment that was not his own, and who used that time to learn instead of suffer. There is a lesson there that goes beyond phrases to use at work. The lesson is that difficult environments are not just obstacles, they are laboratories. Laboratories where you discover what you are made of when the pressure increases, what you keep, what you abandon, what is still intact when the meeting ends and you walk out. If this video made you think differently about a conversation you have had, leave a comment telling me which of the 8 phrases you are going to use first. I am genuinely curious, because the answer says a lot about the kind of situation you are navigating right now. If you want to keep receiving analysis like this, the subscription is right there. And if this was useful, a like costs 1 second and makes a real difference to the reach of the video. There are 2 kinds of people who leave a difficult work environment: those who were destroyed by it, and those who learned something they could never have learned anywhere else. The difference between the 2 groups is not luck. It is not innate talent. It is not resilience as a personality trait you either have or do not have. It is the capacity to stay whole when everything around you is asking you to react, to explode, to retreat, to disappear. Kant spent his entire life on that frontier, between impulse and choice, between reaction and response, between being moved by others and moving from within himself. And he concluded that this frontier is not a destination. It is a place of permanent practice. You are going to lose sometimes. You will react when you should have responded. You will stay silent when you should have spoken. You will use the wrong phrase at the wrong moment. That is not a failure of character. That is the process of learning. The question is not whether you will be perfect. The question is whether, next time, you will have 1 more second than you had before. 1 second between impulse and action. 1 second where reason can enter. 1 second is enough for everything to change. Kant knew that. Now, so do you. Use it well.